Okay. So welcome back, everybody, to this afternoon session. We're entering the final stage of this conference. I hope you didn't eat too much, because we will have another plate of quite heavy and I hope very interesting and encouraging mental food. So actually Maria Arena is a bit late, but we thought we'd just start and then maybe have her as the last or the last speaker. Let's see how it's going. We hope she's on a good way too. Yes, thank you. So I'm very happy to introduce our panelists now. So we have Attiya Waris. Sorry for that. Yeah, she's the independent. Sorry, I just messed up your voice. Sorry for that. It's a bit late for me already. She's the independent expert on foreign debt and international foreign relations and their implications on human rights, and a professor at the University of Nairobi at the Faculty of Law. Welcome, Attiya. And then we got Isabel Ortiz. She's from Global Social Justice and has worked at the UN for super many years, as we were calling it before. Then Jason Braganza, welcome, the director of AFRODAD. And so we're going to speak today about the implications of the current way of how the financial economic system is actually working and how we can ensuring the primacy of human rights in times of systemic crisis. And as you all know, the current obligations, especially for the states in the global south, is very dramatically undermining the fulfillment and the realization of basic human and universal human rights. So we're facing for a long time now a race to the bottom in taxation, unsustainable level of global debt, and these countries, mostly in the global south, have to fulfill obligations in order to attract foreign investors, which is actually dramatically undermining their social and public services. So the panelists will now present how the international community can support states to break out of this vicious circle of finance that undermines human rights and build a global finance architecture that supports actually a virtuous circle of finance, reinforcing and strengthening countries as human rights duty bearers. So please welcome Attiya Waris as the first speaker here. Oh yeah, you arrived. Thank you very much for being here. So this is Maria Arena. She's an MEP at the European Parliament and the Vice President, right, of the Committee on Human Rights. Is the President of the Chairs, sorry for that. Great to have you here too. Thank you. So, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you? Yes, that's pretty clear. So you'll forgive me. This is not my normal voice. I have a pretty bad sore throat. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to be physically in the room with more than 100 people, and knowing that we will not hopefully catch COVID after this. So, thank you for having me, Eurodad. I'm here mainly to talk about my mandate as the UN independent expert on foreign debt and international financial obligations and its implications for economic, social, and cultural rights. It's a very interesting mandate. Previous mandate holders have engaged with Eurodad in the past, but there are a couple of key tools that are in my toolbox, as it were, which could be really useful strategic spaces to operate in. And one of the ones that we do have is actually letters or methods of communication. Traditionally, many of the mandate holders do what are called allegation letters. That's what they're known for, emergency reactions to pressing human rights concerns. But when it comes to issues of foreign debt and international financial obligations, people don't always think there's an urgency about it, but sometimes there is. When a country is in negotiation over debt with the IMF, with a private creditor, very often a voice in that space can make a difference. It doesn't happen very often, but it is something I'd like to encourage people to think about as a strategy going forward. The normal way that people use my mandate is what are called ordinary letters. I work with different stakeholder groups when they want to raise issues of grave concern, but I'll give you an example of one that I recently did, which gave an unsurprising answer. The IMF were reviewing their gender strategy, and we said, well, you know, there's a human rights element to it, and you know, this is the IMF. So of course, myself and a group of mandate holders submitted the letter to the IMF, and they gave me a lovely response to say that they're not a human rights-based institution. Very important piece of information that civil society and other stakeholders can then now use to push advocacy afterwards. So why is that important? For me, it's important because when I was simply an academic professor in a developing country, if I even thought about sending a letter to an organization, I would presume it was a waste of the stamp and any time I spent writing the letter, frankly. Now I am in a position where letters that I send out must be responded to, and if they're not responded to, can cause a diplomatic incident. And then the whole UN machinery does start to kick into action to query why the responses are not coming through. So it's a really great tool to get an answer. I recently sent a letter to the OECD and the European Union. At least the OECD responded, the European Union did not. So different responses to different issues depending on what is happening, but it can cause some concerns, and it's important to use it as a tool where possible. The second is I produce a lot of reports, and previous mandate holders have also produced a lot of reports. Many of these reports do raise issues around foreign debt, around illicit financial flows, and their connection to particular human rights. And again, this is where these reports can be very useful tools going forward. I'm going to just spend a minute before I wind out talking about what I intend to do for the next 2.5 years. So my mandate is 3 years. I'm in the first 8 or 9 months of it. In October of this year, I will be releasing a report on the creation of an international financial authority. Of course, Eurodad's report is very welcome. I'm excited to reference it. But the more voices there are in that space, the better. And the more consistent the calls will be, also the better. That particular report gets presented to the General Assembly's third committee in October. What becomes very important is my mandate has a very clear north-south divide. Please get your state representatives to sit in the room during my presentation, to engage with the reports, to submit contributions. The more we can get countries to take a position on the issue at an individual level, the better it is, because currently this divide over the wealthier and the less wealthier nations is getting segmented much more strongly, and we need to break that. And getting these different spaces to act, and human rights is not a traditional space that they act in, is also a softer way of getting them to see a different side to things. I'm going to stop there because of my voice also, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Attiya. So I guess we very well heard you that you're able to give us an open door when it comes to your reports, and then also to support you in enlarging the space when it comes to what you're writing. So that I would say that's a good virtuous circle then. So next is Isabel Ortiz. You got a presentation for us. So please I mean, the question we actually like you to answer is that you have a most recent research, a very interesting one on the where you found the post-pandemic austerity wave risks being much deeper and more severe than the one after the 2008 financial crisis. So we're happy that you share your key findings with us now on that.
Thank you very much. It is great to be together with you here today. And what I'm going to present is still confidential, so please don't disseminate it. Is the result of an update of the research that we periodically published, and is an update based on the IMF way of fiscal projections. So what I'm going to present, and I thought that an image is better than 1,000 words, is how the IMF fiscal projections show what is happening with public expenditures and with austerity cuts. And what you see here is that the whole wall in red, what you have is the number of countries that are going to be cutting public expenditure this and next year. And as you see, with the exception of Russia, because it's a situation of conflict, the reality is that the whole world is on fire. It means that virtually all countries are cutting currently public expenditures or are going to be cutting public expenditures in the next year. So it's not a very rosy picture, and particularly it's interesting here in what the letter to Attiya Waris, that they were saying that the IMF does not do human rights, because we're going to show that actually this is extremely relevant for human rights. So the IMF fiscal projections contained in the wheel, what they tell us is the numbers, okay? But to understand where the cuts coming, what we did is reading about 300 IMF country reports from 2020 to 2022, and I'm going to go straight to this slide. And to understand where the cuts happening. And we found, and what you have here is the different areas where the cuts are. In a darker blue color are the developing countries, and in the lighter blue color are high-income economies. This is to show that this is not relevant just for Europe, but it's actually mostly relevant to developing countries to the south. So the main adjustment measure that appears in IMF country reports, and here it's not just about the IMF, it's IMF and ministries of finance that are having this dialogue. So, you know, blame goes on both sides. The first measure is targeting social protection. And that means that if you have a social protection system that covers this amount of people, they are presenting an improvement, which is actually cutting the number of people receiving the benefits, targeting more to the poorest, only at the bottom, for cost savings. Interestingly, the reports say that this is an improvement in efficiency, but the reality is a reduction of coverage, which is against international conventions and recommendations agreed by all countries, employers, and trade unions, which all committed to expand social protection, and particularly social protection floors. So that is the first measure that we saw in 120 country reports. The second measure is the cutting or capping the wage bill, and that abstract name means cutting the number of civil servants or their salaries. Now, if you look at a public budget in a government, in general, the majority of civil servants tend to be teachers. Teachers, health workers, and civil servants working at the local level, all of them doing very important social jobs. So if you cut their number or reduce their salaries, and they are forced then to take other jobs and things like that to survive, because teachers at the front line get very low salaries, they are actually having a very negative impact on education, health, or the public services that they might be doing. And that we saw in 91 countries, and there is a report by ActionAid, if you have not seen it, that is very good, and I recommend you to read it because it documents that better. The next reform is eliminating subsidies, which includes fuel subsidies, but also agricultural and food subsidies at a time that food prices are at top. And the next type of more prevalent reform is pension reforms with a view to sustainability and financial issues, cutting and adjusting pensioners' benefits to the law, which means that future pensioners are going to receive lower pensions, including ourselves, if we allow, these pension reforms continue to happen. And not only that, this happens in about 72 countries, but not only that, in about other 47, they allowed kind of holidays into Social Security contributions as a kind of support to enterprises. That means enterprises stop paying Social Security contributions during the time of COVID. Remember, this is 2020, 2022. So it means that now Social Security systems are more unsustainable because they have this financing gap. Then next reform, which is interesting, it is what they call SOE reforms. At the beginning, we were reading and say, how can it be that there are many state-owned enterprise reforms if there are hardly any state-owned enterprises left? And what happens here, they mostly mean public services, like transport, like water supply, sewerage. And the idea is to privatize them or to put them in situations that they can be commercialized through PPPs and others. Then there is a straight discussion into PPPs, privatization of a number of sectors, and as well as labor flexibilization reforms, which have detrimental impacts on workers. And last but not least, even at time of COVID, when the marching orders of the IMF was not to touch health expenditures, but to protect them because of COVID, even in 18 countries, this advice to cut expenditures, including Belgium. So the direct impact on human rights are obvious, and particularly on women. If you see, you cut social protection, public services like education, health, water, eliminate different types of subsidies, and do labor flexibilization and social security reforms, very obvious has enormous human rights implications to the negative, and women are particularly affected. And the worst of that, and I end with this, is that this is not needed. All this human suffering that they're thinking about is absolutely unnecessary, because there are options for financing and for fiscal space, even in the poorest countries. And there are at least 8 options that any government has. Not all countries will have the 8, but even the poorest countries will have many of the 8. And they can use them, and as countries have been using them for years, and in that way avoid these austerity cuts. And it's very important that we promote, we make the case against austerity, and there is a collective that is proposing a campaign, End Austerity, join the collective. But it's also very important that we propose the alternatives, so we show that governments are going to take unnecessary suffering. And these options are, and you know them very well, increasing progressive tax revenues, and that means, not VAT, which is regressive, but focus more on income and wealth taxation, including taxes to the financial sector that in many countries, pay very little. And we have phenomenal examples, and just to give you one, in Mongolia, a little tax on copper exports paid a universal child benefit. That was a beautiful example. Then second, you could fight illicit financial flows that are illegal and they need to be fought, like money laundering, tax evasion. Third, restructure existing debt, and all of you are more experts than me. And we have very good examples. About 60 countries in recent years have restructured debts. Fourth, for social protection, instead of doing social security reforms because the system is sustainable, you could provide people in the informal sector with good contracts. So that way you will increase social security coverage and contributions and have healthy systems. You could lobby for more aid and transfers. You could adopt a more accommodative macroeconomic framework. You could reallocate public expenditures from sectors that have no social use, like defense, by the way, to those that have more social use. And then also there are international solutions that all of you work on, like, as calling for more SDRs, etc. So they're alternative. And these decisions normally about austerity cuts or financing, they're taken behind closed doors at the Ministry of Finance by a few technocrats and often with help with some IMF mission. This is unacceptable. These decisions affect the lives of millions of people, so it's essential that they are discussed in an open national dialogue with all people involved and be taken to the parliaments and really have a discussion on who is affected by the different options and which will be better for the public good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for this very introductive and brief overview, exactly on time, actually, 7 minutes. So, Jason, Isabel just gave us like an overview of 9 measures countries could follow to stop austerity. So we wonder what, from your perspective, are the most important, or the 3 most important in Africa for the fulfillment of basic human rights.
All right. Thank you very much. And first of all, let me just say thanks to Eurodad for inviting me to speak at this conference, given the theme and especially what we've heard over the past few days. I want to begin by echoing my colleague's point, Chennai, that she made this morning about in her session about who it is that are affected most by the inability for us to achieve human rights and for us to achieve any sort of sustainable and sort of radical way of thinking things forward. And this is women, and particularly women of color. And I think this is where I'd like to start my discussion, and building on both what Attiya and Isabel have said. I don't have any nice pictures, but I have 4 points that will hopefully be 3 that help us understand what it is we're trying to achieve here. And I categorize them as follows. I call them the 4 Ps. The first one is power. And when you look at how the world is structured at present, and sentiments of what Attiya has just said, when you write to an international organization asking about human rights issues and the response is, we're not a human rights organization, I think that tells you about how power is situated, and how institutions that are considered very powerful perceive their roles in this current setup. And I think, when you look at power, then you look at it, in my opinion, in 3 ways. The structural one, which is, between institutions and between institutions. You then also look at the power structures between men and women, and how that is defined. Then you also look at the economic and financial power in terms of who has the ability to direct the way the world moves, or how the world, which direction the world takes. And I think this is very important if we're going to start thinking, or if you want to center the idea of human rights in terms of how development finance is then structured, generated, and utilized for centering the issue of human rights in developing regions and in the global south more specifically. And so therefore, understanding power, its origins, its concentration, and its application then tells us a lot about how and what we need to do in terms of rebooting the system, as is the theme of this conference this week, and making sure that human rights are at the center of our modus operandi going forward. The second P is about politics. And politics here is about being aware of where human rights are being respected and how and how we then need to redress our politics. At the moment, as Isabel's presentation has shown, is that the politics is driven by economic interests, right? And so far we've seen, and even in the session just before lunch, there was a couple of colleagues who spoke about the idea of economic interests being put at the center of how political decisions are being taken. The politics of demonizing one, let me illustrate this with an example of what I mean by economic interest, or why politics is is very important here. There is a politics of demonizing one form of incursion while celebrating a different type in the name of spreading democracy. And when you look at the idea of how politics then, or global politics is defined, we cannot reboot the system if we have that type of political architecture or political narrative that's dominating how we do things. The politics of where one group of people's human rights are seen as superior to those of others in times of crisis, that isn't going to work either. And I'll illustrate this with an example. In the current conflict in Ukraine and Russia, we saw how the human rights of those who are trying to leave Russia, there was a distinction between if you were of a European descent or if you were African descent. There was a difference in how those individuals were being treated. And yet we're talking about trying to center our work and center the way we think about finance in terms of human rights, then we need to get our politics right. Everybody's human rights should be the same. It should be universal. I'm going to use another example here. Over the past 2 weeks, there've been monarchs across the tunnel, or across the tunnel that are doing supposedly very big things. Here, the monarch here is in Belgium, visiting and doing what he needs to do as a royalty. But the analysis shows that there is very little awareness about maybe the historical past amongst the general populace. It's being celebrated as a big, important point in time. Across the channel in the UK, the Queen celebrated her Jubilee year. And in both cases, there's a lot of jubilation, celebration about this system, about this political system, that doesn't really then understand or appreciate the historical atrocities that have taken place. So if we want to center, again, bring it back to the primacy of human rights in finance and in Africa specifically, then we need to rethink and reboot the politics. And it's not just of us here in the room, it's also sensitizing citizens, not in Africa, but even here, about those historical pasts. It should still be in the memory. There should be people on the streets challenging why aren't apologies, or why aren't these families being held accountable for the kind of actions that they've taken. And I think this is very important if we're going to try and reboot the system. The third P is profit. The idea of profit can no longer be the mantra for development finance. This idea that we're constantly leveraging private finance in order to access or to provide public goods and public services, it cannot be the mantra. This morning again, and I'm referring to the sessions this morning very much so because they touched a spot in me when I was thinking through my speaking notes, and one of the speakers said that there is not enough public money to solve these problems, and therefore that is why we need private finances. But when I look back and I think about the global financial crisis, not too long ago, governments very quickly found public money to bail out banks, right? Now in the current crisis here with COVID-19, public money was very quickly found to support businesses to make sure that they don't go under, they don't go bankrupt. Public money was found very quickly to subsidize private research for COVID-19 vaccines, which then was also utilized as a barrier to entry for developing country governments. So when we talk about development finance and centering human rights in the context of developing regions in Africa specifically, then we need to debunk and declutter this idea of profit being the center of what what profit actually means. So it seems also that public money is accessible to those who need, it's acceptable when those who need it meet a certain type of criteria, right? And this goes back to the idea of politics and the idea of power. If you meet a certain type of criteria, if you're a multinational corporation, that's threatening to go under, then you sort of qualify for public money. Let's take a different type of example in terms of issues of public money and why this is a big problem, or where profit is at the center, and it then also becomes a big problem. There's this one country in the current conflict that's currently going on here just next door, that has pledged and committed a huge sum of money in military aid and expenditure. I think cumulatively up until today, that money surpasses the entire SDR allocation that Africa got. This is mostly public money, but then is being chased after profit because there's an industry that benefits from there. So I think it's important when you're asking the question about what are the bottlenecks, what are the challenges affecting development finance or undermining human rights in Africa, for us to think about the kind of model. Profit does not understand human rights. It doesn't understand the idea of development. It does not care about the climate or the environment, right? Profit, it has only one purpose, is to enrich a minority at the expense of the majority. And lastly, the fourth P is people. And you'll excuse me for going a little bit over time, but the idea to reboot the system is that we need to remind ourselves that all of us here, all of us around the world, are actually people and citizens. We're not just living organisms that are passing through life, trying to merely just exist. We need to be at the center of everything that we do. And this does not mean that the stuff that we do here is directed at a particular group of people in the global south. The idea of people is that we are all people, whether we're from the global south or from the global north. And again, I refer to the two events of the royalty, right? There's no self-conscientization about what those things are, what those things represent when you celebrate a royal family that has been involved in so many very messy things, and there's no people conscientization on asking those questions. We forget that, therefore, in the North, people in the North are focused on their own issues, but then the work that they do to sort of quote unquote liberate is only meant for those in the global South. So I think it's very important then, as I conclude, that these four Ps really are not necessarily about just the dollar value, right? That is about undermining human rights and the types of finance that undermine human rights in Africa. But it's an entire ecosystem. It's an entire way of thinking. It's the entire way of life that needs to be rethought and reconsidered if we are really going to try and reboot the system. And I think that is what these four Ps, at least for me, and in the context of what Attiya and Isabel have presented, seem to align very well with this idea of what undermines human rights and financing in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Maria, Jason actually mentioned power as the first P, so the European Union is without any doubt one of the powerful actors when it comes to the international power game. So what is your opinion how the European Union should act in respect to what we heard now?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. So as chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee, I'm really glad to be here with you. And I can't agree more with all that have been said just before. And I must say, perhaps, unfortunately, I'm a kind of minority in the European institution. And you receive a letter, or you receive the argument from the IMF saying that they are not human rights organizations. I hope that Europe is not writing to you saying that they are not human rights organizations, but I'm not sure about that. I used to be in the trade subcommittee before chairing this human rights committee. Even they called it subcommittee, so you can understand the level they give to human rights at the European Parliament. It's not a committee. It doesn't make really a difference, but the name is a subcommittee. So my first fight is for the next mandate. It's not for me because I won't be there, but for the next one is to make this subcommittee a committee. And this is a very important political message for the rest of the Parliament. This is the first thing. But I used to be in the Trade Committee, the previous mandate, and I was really focused on human rights. And they said, you have to change committee because it's not the right one. We are dealing with trade. And it's exactly the same that you receive from the IMF. They don't want, when it comes to economy, and I totally agree with you, to speak about this human rights issue. But I must say that they will be forced to speak about this human rights issue, because it is a question of democracy. And when we are traveling all over the world, people are very fed up about this model. And so if they are not going to change it, they will be forced to change it, because people will ask for it. So what we are trying to do is trying to do it less with the chaos. I was in Tunisia last week, and I met with a lot of people, civil society, and they told me, we don't trust democracy because we fought for democracy. We had a power, a parliament, a government. They didn't respect democracy, and people, for 10 years, they were not respected with democracy. And so they said, we are ready to forget our human rights, our liberties, to eat, to have the right to eat. And this is really a failure. This is really something that we are living in this country. So choosing between democracy and eating. And we can't be in this situation. And we are living the same thing in Europe. You have a lot of people saying, we don't trust democracy because you are not representing us, because you are not fighting for us. And so it's really a message that we have to have in mind, for the sake of democracy and for the sake of equality for people. So I think, why do we need IMF? And 10 years ago, I met an African friend, and he told me, you know, it was more than 10 years. We're not so young. I think it was 20 years ago. And he told me, you, Maria, in Europe, you will leave the really harsh measure that we have had in our countries from the IMF. It was 20 years ago. And we had it in Greece after the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, with this troika. We were just in this situation. And so it is not to say that IMF is just for developing country, making these reforms and asking for, no, it is also for European countries. And you said that in Belgium, for example, a lot of reforms are made in the IMF lines. So of course, we are living exactly the same, and people suffering from these IMF conditions. So why do we need IMF? And when people said, we have not enough money to pay for these services, it is not true. We don't have enough money because we are not taking money where it is. So tax evasion, tax avoidance, because I live in Belgium and we have a lot of tax avoidance. It is not tax evasion, but it is really legally you can avoid the tax system. Some people can, others can't. So this tax evasion, tax avoidance is really something that we have to fight against. You can't ask Human Rights Subcommittee to fight for human rights without having these leverages. So it's important to have this regulation at the European level, but at the worldwide level. So Europe has to use its political power at the multilateral level to fight for and to fight against this tax evasion. The second one is corruption. And of course, if there is corruption in some countries, it is also a way not to pay their tax. And it is not the paradise of human rights. I was in Qatar to speak about human rights. Not an easy task, but we have to convince, we have to try, we have to find ways to discuss. And I was with the ILO representative, and he said, Maria, do you know, I was really surprised because Qatar decided to have some regulation in the country because of the World Cup. So they need to have a nice image. So they decided to take some regulation on workforce. And do you know which are the companies that are not willing to respect these regulations? They are European multinationals. They are the ones that are not respecting the human rights regulation in Qatar. So it was really difficult for me in Qatar to speak about human rights as European, and having the Minister of Employment, he was the chair of the human rights body in Qatar, and he told me, I want to respect human rights, and you have to help me because I'm the only one in the government, so you have to help me. But you, as European companies, you don't want to respect human rights. So you have to have regulation in Europe to make your company respect human rights when they are outside, even also when they are inside, because if you are in the south of Italy or in the south of Spain, when you see all the agricultural system, they are not respecting human rights, neither. So we have to have very strong regulation on this. And we are working, so I decided not to be in trade committee, but I said, but I will be really more focused on trade and businesses in the Human Rights Subcommittee. So we have different regulation for the moment in the Human Rights Subcommittee, working with the Jury Subcommittee. It is on the due diligence. It is to guarantee that we have this responsibility for companies, European and non-European companies, when they are outside, to respect these human rights, environmental rights also, because we are speaking also about climate change, but for me, they are totally linked. Human rights and climate, it's one thing. We work on these both issues. So this directive is discussed for the moment between the European Commission. The proposal from the Commission is really not acceptable, so we are working on it for responsibility for companies when they are working outside Europe, and to be sure that it is not human rights brainwashing. It is really, and to make them accountable for what they are doing. And if there are damages, they have to have, they have to go to the tribunals, not just to pay administrative fees for it. So it's really something that we want to have at the European one. We also work on the environment, human rights with the ENVI committee. And when you said that political are driven by economy, this week we were at Strasbourg and we decided on new laws about climate change. And exactly, you are right. For 3 weeks, lobbies, industrial lobbies, made a so shamed lobby on people, on MEPs, and finally, we didn't succeed in having these rules on the right to pollute the ETS system. So it is because of company, because they don't want to change. They don't want to change for climate, they don't want to change for human rights, and we have to force them. And it's what I said, unfortunately, we are not a majority, but with your help, with your support, with your, I don't know how to say, the way that you are communicating about that, it is helping us because people are voting finally. And we need to have people supporting the one who are supporting human rights and environmental rights. And for that, we have to explain to them, to have a narrative, a very special narrative of them. And the last thing is that Human Rights Subcommittee is always giving the floor to civil society and trade unions. when you have difficulties in your country, when it's not possible to have the floor in your country because there is a shrinking of human rights defenders and NGOs, we always open the door for these people at the European Subcommittee to give a more broad, I don't know how to say that in English, sentiment of that human rights are threatened in some countries, and we can defend them in Europe. So this is really the way we are working at the European level. Not easy at all, but trying to convince more and more people to go in this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. So Emilia Reyes yesterday, as you maybe all remember, said we should actually stop with the small step policy or politics. And as I understood her, she said we should actually climb the barricades, but not on the street. So I didn't really have an idea where else than on the street, but maybe we can do it in your committee. So we're now open for questions. Because we started 10 minutes late, right? We maybe have another 15 minutes. And I just give the chance to Yolanda and the people. No questions on, okay, great. So, sorry, the first hand was in the back there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll stand up. Hi, I'm Shireen Talat from the Arab Watch Coalition. Actually, I'm Egyptian. I live in Morocco. I work in Tunisia. So imagine. I'm telling you this because you said, I have a comment and then I have a question. But because you said that, yes, we are all suffer, but it's very unfair to put what we are going through in the Global South with what's happening in Europe. It's not unfair because, yes, there is cuts or reforms in Belgium, but there's no healthcare in Egypt or in Morocco or Tunisia. So the comparison is not fair at all. But yes, we all want the IMF to adopt human rights, and we call for that, but we are doing our job. But I guess it's also the time for the European Parliament, for the representatives of the IMF, on the IMF board for Europe to push for human rights too. I know you are struggling. It's not, well, it's the destiny of the word human rights, yani, everywhere, but you have the leverage that I don't have. You have at least a subcommittee I don't have. You can raise the issue, you can raise the questions with the European EDs. You can push, I can't. I can push from the outside, and trying to lobby from the inside, but you have a powerful world more than I do. So think about it. Think about pushing more for at least adopt the word human rights inside the IMF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next question, we just collect, I guess, and then, right? Yeah. Yes, there.
Just quickly, an additional proposal. I'm happy to hear all of your wonderful proposals, but I'm missing one point. I think it's now high time to revive the campaign for a financial transaction tax. In addition to all the others, what you said, Jason, with the public money and with illicit flows and everything, but you know, in 2016, we were about to have it agreed. There was a long European process to show it's possible, and it would not tax the people, the average normal people. It would tax the rich, the companies, the speculation. It could help regulate the financial markets and so on. Don't want to repeat that. But I wonder why it's so silent now. I'm not surprised the politicians are silent, but civil society should at least include it in the package of campaign.
Can't agree more with the remarks that you have made this afternoon. Basically, I don't have question, but I would like to really raise an issue related to what you have said, the poverty. In fact, when we talk about human rights, we would like to talk about economic, social, cultural right and right to development. Particularly, I'm coming from one of the least developed country. So this is a serious issue. When we talk to our development partner, this is not a serious human rights issue for them. They want to talk about civil and political rights only. That is the reason why you talk about trade in your committee or subcommittee. They think that this is not a human rights issue. But for us, particularly those who are coming from Africa, Asia, or UN-defined least developed countries, trade is the human rights issue. Poverty is the serious human rights issue for us. So if we don't take poverty as a human rights issue, we are not really addressing the human rights issue at all. And then our moderator rightly said that yesterday we have a speaker from Mexico, our good friend. In fact, we are reiterating what she was stating yesterday. In fact, one of the reasons why most of the European, American, Australian, Canadian multinational companies want to invest in a country where human rights records are not good is this the reason, in fact, what you have witnessed in Qatar. So that's why we, those who are coming from Africa, Asia, least developed country, want our European friends, comrades, to talk to your politician, talk to your investors and development partners, see to focus on that. Because this very agency, they are not really able to bypass this human rights standard in your country, but they want to do this in our part of the world. This is not fair. That's why this is the serious human rights issue, and we have to look at this seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have time for other questions, or shall we? Okay.
Yeah, I think.
So who was first? Just go on.
Okay.
Okay.
I had a question as well. But
How you had? Sorry, Yolanda.
I have the power. I have the microphone.
Yeah.
So this is Yolanda from Eurodad. It's more a comment than a question. But I mean, I get from your presentations and obviously our readings on how human rights are being violated and ignored even by international institutions that are public and should be accountable for their human rights violations but are not, that the voluntary approach to human rights is not working. So we need stronger regulatory frameworks, as Maria was saying, to make those binding. We have this proposal being discussed, long process for a binding treaty on businesses and human rights on the table at the UN. We have proposals on human rights impact assessment for IMF policies that independent experts on that and human rights made. So we have different proposals on the table to make those regulatory frameworks stronger, but I have the feeling that we're not pushing enough for those, that I don't know, as if we were afraid, as if we knew this is not going to work. But I don't know, I guess the question is, do you see space to push for further and stronger regulatory approaches to make human rights compliance binding for businesses, but also for international institutions, DFIs, MDBs, etc.?
So you two here, thanks, Yolanda.
Hi, this is Eva La Rosa from the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. I'm the Latin America coordinator of the coalition. I came from Uruguay. Yes, just building on the previous comments, I think all the issues that you have been tackling in the conversation and we all these days are really key and are all interlinked, and it's important for us to be really good at explaining in the different forums, in the different places that we have access to these interlinkages. But also I think one of the key strategies and the key things we need to do, since we have this opportunity to be in so many places, is also to make sure that our members, our partners, our communities, those that are really affected in every day, that our experiences, the life experiences, are there to tell directly to those making decisions and to try to break these hypocritical attitudes, because it's easy to get lost in the details, and for people we often hear that it's too much, it's too complicated to understand the system. Yes, we are sometimes distracted by these powerful actors doing a lot of things, playing a lot of games, but at the end, the system, the inequality, and how it works is clear, and is a terrible thing for many millions of people. And we are working with those on the ground, and I'm happy to not be there and to have other of my partners, colleagues, of members speaking the truth and speaking better than I am able to speak. But I think we need to have these people, because these people have a power to speak those that are hypocrite, that are having good speeches, but then they turn and they, you know, they capture, and they do their business as usual. And I think you will have an opportunity these days here in Brussels, because a committee of indigenous people from Brazil is coming. Maybe you are aware, the APIV people is coming, and I think they are attending in the parliament and having several meetings. I think we need our members, our partners, these communities present and speaking loud and giving them the space, because they have a lot of things to say. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Apolline Nishimbere. I'm from Burundi and currently based in France and working with Eurodad. So my question is directed to Maria, because you've been so vocal on Burundi issues. So I would like to know how powerful, or to what extent, your subcommittee can influence European Union decisions. Because I used to work with politicians in Burundi, and one day we were negotiating for lifting the sanctions on Burundi. Then I talked to one diplomat, European diplomat, and he said, just don't worry about what Maria is writing on Twitter. We only look at what the Council of Ministers say. So how powerful, or to what extent can you influence the decisions of executive powers in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, one last, how many questions are there left? It's 3 o'clock, but so let's take at least one, and then.
Hello, Nabil Abdo from Oxfam International. So I just have a question to Attiya on, can you elaborate more on the report you talked about for October and the International Financial Authority? So thank you.
Okay, perfect.
We have a question from streaming. This time it's not from me, sorry. It's from our beloved Bodo Elmers from Global Policy Forum. And there's a question for Maria Arena. He says, a long-standing CSO position is that states must prioritize human rights over debt service, human rights spending over debt service, even if the implication is that the country defaults on sovereign debt payments. Parliaments hold budget rights, but I could not cite a single case where a parliament has refused to adopt a budget that violates human rights, a budget designed in a way that it secured the payments to creditor while at the same time violated the human rights of citizens. Why is that? He's asking.
Okay, great. I guess a lot of questions are actually for Maria, so maybe you can support her during the answers. But maybe you can start with the question of Bodo, and then I would start at the beginning again with the question about, you know, the critique actually of the comparison between budget cuts in Europe and elsewhere. I think that's a very important point actually.
Yeah, just rapidly. So the first one on the budget. When we vote the budget, it is the whole budget, and it is sometimes difficult to say that we are voting against the total budget because of a human rights issue. we did it in Europe when it comes to the Frontex issue, when it comes to migration issue, and we decided not to give this agency the budget because it was really violating human rights. And we succeeded in finally have the dismiss of the director of Frontex with an Olaf inquiry, with these budgets being blocked. So it's not easy, but we can do it. So this is an example, and we have to do more. In French, we say comparaison n'est pas raison. I don't know how to say that in English. To compare is not always reasonable to do so, of course. But for the narrative here in Europe, it is important to tell people that what you are living in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Morocco, not having this health protection, it is not only there, it can happen here. And it is important to give them this example, to say that what you are living can happen to them. So it is not to compare the situation between both, because I totally agree with you that when you have nothing, it's really difficult to live than when you have something and you are just reducing it. But a lot of people here in Europe, they think that what they have, they will never lose it. And in fact, it's not the case. They are losing it for the moment. And we have to show them what does it mean when you are not protected. Because, you know, rich people, they don't care about being protected because they have money. And a lot of non-rich people, I'm not speaking about poor people, but non-rich people think that they can be rich one day, and so they don't need it. They don't want to pay for it. So we need to have this narrative. So it's not to compare the difficulties between both people, but also to give a narrative here in Europe to show that it's really something fragile here in Europe. When it comes to trade, I'm not to say that I'm against trade, not at all. Sometimes yes. But what we have as trade relationship between Europe and developing country, it is not fair trade. It is not guaranteeing people to receive something from this trade. We have a lot of trade relationship with a lot of countries, but they are post-colonial trade relationship. It is just to guarantee that the commodities that were in the history, in the end of the occupying power, is just arriving in Europe without having tax. So, and in the trade relationship that we have, in the trade deal that we have, it's exactly what we are trying to continue. And what I say is, okay, we can have trade relationship with countries that can bring money to the countries. But first, we have to have modalities to pay at the right price the commodities. If it is just to steal them, there is no use of having trade. So I think it's important to have this, how to pay correctly these commodities. And the second one is we need to have a TSD chapter in trade relationship. What is TSD chapter? Is something that if one of the party is not respecting human rights or environmental rights, we can stop trade. We can stop it if we are not respecting them. And so we need to have this leverage. For the moment, we don't. We just have trade, whatever the result of this trade on the population, on the origin country. And so it is not to say that I'm against, it's to say that I want to regulate this kind of trade, to be sure that it benefits to people and not to companies. And the last thing is, fight impunity is really something that we have to do, because someone spoke about people, they see that we say, okay, we can go to the ICC. And so they will wait for years and years and years without having the result. And so it is important to fight this impunity, the business impunity and the state impunity. And so we need to reflect on the new instrument to really have solutions for these people, and not to say, oh, it's really difficult, so we will see in 20 years the result of this. It's not to say that we don't have to go to the ICC, but we have to have alternative way of fighting on this. And on Burundi, I'm desperate about Burundi. I don't know how to say that. He's right, these diplomats. I don't like the diplomats. I don't like them. Sorry if you have diplomats in the room. I don't like diplomats, but this is my personal point of view. But when I don't want diplomats to make these politics. We are in a very difficult position in Burundi. And what the diplomats are giving to the decision makers, that is the council, is that everything is okay. And we need to work with Burundi because it's geopolitically important in the region of Great Lake. This is the message from the diplomat, because they don't live with people being suffering in the country. The diplomats are living with diplomats. And so this is the problem. I need diplomats that are living with people and they are bringing information, the truth to the decision making. And for the moment, it's not the case. And so the council decided to not to have the sanction mechanism on Burundi because they received disinformation from diplomats. I think that we have to fight them. This is my position. I need to have the truth, not people having drinks in the evening.
Great. Truth, not drinks. Jason, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the idea of wake up the financial transaction tax from the debt, if you want. Or if you want to say something else, it's okay too. And then, then Attiya, and then I want to give Attiya the chance to elaborate a little bit more on the report as it was asked before.
I was going to say something else. There was a couple of other points that I had picked out from the questions, and I can't agree even more with Eva on this. It is something that we have, civil society organizations have been advocating for a very long time, and it is one, again, it's one of these in my 4 Ps, I would say, around politics and power, that is needed to reboot the system and rethink about different types of alternatives in terms of how we get development financing moving in a way that then also can be used to embody and empower human rights. But the 2 other points that caught my attention in this is the point, Maria, that you were making, your trip to Qatar. It's interesting that the information that is then presented to you about who are those undermining human rights are companies that are based in Europe, but then there is no sanction. Whether it is at the commission level or whether it is at the country at a national level. I mean, these companies are also headquartered in so-called sovereign states within the union. What is the challenge, I would say, in a sovereign state taking unilateral action against a multinational corporation that is undermining human rights? But what it also shows me in this is that we haven't got any of those 4 Ps correct, and why those 4 Ps remain important, because there's still an element of power that is allowing these multinational corporations to go outside of the Commission or outside of the EU area to misbehave. There is a profit-driven agenda, because I guess those profits, many of them are probably coming back here, and so there's no incentive maybe for government or for the state within the EU to take any action. But then it's also, differentiated approaches to people. So as long as the human rights of people in Europe are not being infringed or undermined or impugned, it's okay for the human rights for people in the global south, in the Middle East, to continue to be undermined, as long as we have a very nice World Cup and people make money and so on, and we can go on holiday to Doha. You know what I mean? So I think it's something that we really need to think about if we want to reboot the system. The very last point on what Yolanda said, it is interesting about this binding treaty, and it's linked to this idea of if the misdemeanor is known, states can take action. I think that should also be an entry point for our advocacy. Can we force states to act now? Because we know how the challenges of trying to push for these binding agreements at the global level. They take a lot of time, but there are also things that we can think about doing now. The conflict in Russia is a very nice example of how quickly sanctions can be imposed, depending on which side of the table you sit on. So I think that's something for us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Attiya, on your report, and then Isabel can close with 2 other points as you wish.
Yeah, but I also want to make another point. We're not taking instruction very well from the chair. We apologize. But I will. I promise to be as brief as I possibly can.
Thank you.
So I want to weigh in actually on this discussion, and I think that the core problem from where I sit is that corporations under the European Convention on Human Rights have a right. They are right holders, just like human beings are right holders. And this, for me, is a fundamental problem, and it's what causes a lot of problems outside Europe. So companies in Africa, Latin America, and Asia are not rights holders. But when you have a European company coming into a country where it is not a rights holder, but its reference point is that understanding that it's a rights holder, you now have this whole problem of, okay, this is now different from what we're used to, but do they really understand how different that is and what that means? And then you're moving into a space where the regulation in this other part of the world is not as robust as it is in European states. So for me, there's a lot to do with the inability of corporations to self-regulate. Rather than talking about no more voluntary, I think it's about no more self-regulation. And it's about targeting where to start having the regulation take more concrete steps, I think. But it's a big conversation, and happy to continue with it. But I also think from a human rights perspective that whenever we try to question issues, we question issues from the content rights. But what about the issue of access to justice of states? I'll give you an example. Whenever a country goes into crisis, the result of the crisis is that their funds get frozen in foreign states. That's what's been happening. But at the same time, they continue to have investment disputes. One of the biggest problems facing many countries right now is that their investment disputes must go to arbitration, another huge problem, right? But arbitration requires you to pay in advance before you can begin the process. So this same country that is going through a transition has its money frozen and cannot actually resolve the investment disputes because it has no money, which is frozen. It's that circle that we've been talking about. And access to justice for developing states, and then removing this whole secrecy and privacy around dispute resolution, again, is very much a human rights approach, which I'd love to see your committee work on. Yes. But the report, and then I'm done. So thank you for asking about the report, Nabil. It's something I'm working on currently. The previous mandate holder last year released a report on the creation of an international debt architecture. For me, this is the next step, tax architecture and/or a fiscal architecture, and it just coincidentally is an idea that I developed when Eurodad's report came out, so it's going to hopefully have a lot of resonance. I've been receiving contributions from both states, as well as civil societies and private individuals. And of course, because my mandate is a public mandate, anybody can submit contributions. The report gets finalized, and I will present it at the third committee of the General Assembly. And this is where I have an interesting problem like Maria's, because the third committee is human rights, the second committee is finance. So none of the finance people ever come in to hear me speak in the human rights. Yeah, another whole conversation. But the whole point is to try and to present to the world, and hopefully it is the right time, on how we can take steps forward to move a lot of the debates and the discussions that have been siloed in regional spaces and in economic blocks into more democratic spaces with a human rights underpinning to it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Attiya. So last 2 points from you, Isabel, and then we close. Actually, the the final ceremony already starts at in 10 minutes, more or less. So we're gonna postpone it to, okay, 20 to 4, something like that. Yeah, okay, great.
Okay, so quickly, I wanted to end with a positive note. And first I was surprised that there were no questions about austerity, and I thought, oh no. So, and these people just suddenly think, oh, this is something unavoidable. No, it is not, okay? This is the vision that the IMF and ministries of finance have of the future. And they, well, of the current moment. They think they're planning a world in which more than 6 billion people will live with austerity cuts, or 85% of the world population. But this does not need to be like that. And to give you the positive note, last year we do this update based on the IMF WEO periodically. So last year they thought that 159 countries were going to be cutting public expenditures. And it's not true, it did not happen. This year is about 120. So many more countries did not follow that advice. And that's why our actions are so important to denounce the cuts, because they don't need to happen. And I hope that many of you are going to come now to us and join the End Austerity Movement collective. You see that Eurodad has put some posters up there. So please contact Chiara Mariotti or Nabil Abdo at Oxfam, or Shirin Talat at Arab Watch, or or myself, yes. So please join. It is important work to ensure that this vision does not happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very interesting words and panels, and also the questions. Really appreciate it. And we don't forget the financial transaction tax. I guess we're going to discuss that at another occasion. So thank you.
And thank you for the chair.
Oh yeah, sorry for the messed up introduction.
Dominic, thank you. You were not really
oh, yes. Slight change of plan. We are slightly delayed. So first of all, a warm thanks, Maria Arena. It was really a pleasure having you, and look forward to continued collaboration at the European level and together with our partners, as well as hopefully in collaboration between the independent expert and us with the EU. So thank you very much, Attiya, Isabella, Jason, and Dominic, definitely for being moderator. I hope that on that note, it is an inspirational note for us to also close this conference. Originally, the idea was that we do a short break, the opportunity for you to also basically